there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be my wrap-up for the last week of April and the first couple of days of May. The first thing that I read last week was a book that I mentioned during my Tome Topple wrap-up, which is Thomas Keneally's The Daughters of Mars. This details the lives of two Australian nurses during the First World War. They are sisters, and they have some drama related to the death of their mother hanging over them for a bit. And it details their lives as they're serving at various places in the Mediterranean, so when Gallipoli is happening, and on the Western Front when the Somme is happening, and so on. The author did a few interesting things in the book. He talks in an introduction about using a style that is more common in historical First World War writing with dashes rather than commas, which is actually something I do in my writing, and people complain about it, so it was kind of fun to see that there. But it is one of those things where I wouldn't have noticed it if he hadn't mentioned it in the introduction, so I thought it was funny that it was in the introduction rather than in notes at the end. The other interesting thing that this book does is it ends with a short little meditation on the randomness of fate, and then tells us about two obituaries, each of which is about a different person, and then we're told one of them is wrong. For me, if the book had ended right there, I would have thought that was brilliant. I would have thought that was a great ending. You wouldn't know which of the two was correct. But then the author goes on and he gives us what could have happened, one scenario, but what really happened, scenario two. It is sort of giving a concrete ending, but it sort of it also casts doubt on which is the correct one. So when I added this book to my Goodreads list, I peeked at some of the reviews and comments that you see there, and a lot of people were calling that ending a cop-out. Because they wanted to have one concrete ending. I was basically on the other side of that, since I would have rather had something more open-ended. But it's definitely an interesting choice that got people talking, so that's a neat thing. I thought a lot of this wasn't really as strong as it could have been. I felt a little bit like he was going through the boxes that you check, like this is about the First World War, so we need to have a gas attack scene, and we need to have a boat sinking, and we need to have, you know, the facial injury and some shell shock cases. There need to be a few class issues. We need to have some sexuality issues. And I will say respect to the book, because you often see talking about male sexuality in First World War, not just fiction, but nonfiction as well. And this one decides to look at it from a female angle, even though it's a very minor part. And at that point I felt like they were just checking, he was just checking the boxes of we need to talk about these issues because this is a First World War story. But I did appreciate that at least it was that slightly different angle. It talks a bit about post-war adjustments, again, very small at the end, where I felt like he's checking the boxes. But at the same time, it all works. I would say it was engaging, but not necessarily enthralling. And again, the ending was probably the most interesting part. I then read this short little book from the L'Âge du Rock series, which is the David Bowie graphic biography. You can see that there. In English, the English versions of this are called Tribute, but it is the same series. They have these for a bunch of artists. I'm sending this to my sister to read to my nephew. It's not great. It's basically like a Wikipedia biography that's been illustrated, and the illustrations aren't spectacular, but it does what it's supposed to do, so there's not much you can say about that. I followed that up by reading Hellblazer Shoot, which is a collection of one-offs and short stories that appeared in things like Vertigo used to have their holiday specials that had short stories from all their main books. It has those. It has the title story Shoot, which is the book from the issue from Warren Ellis's run, where because it was scheduled to be published just after the Columbine shootings happened and it was about a school shooting, it was pulled. Warren Ellis didn't like that, and so that was part of why he left the book, I think. And a few other short stories. It is not a single story bound up, it's all these shorter items. I had read some of them, but not all of them, which is why I picked it up. And yeah, if you're a Hellblazer completionist and you're collecting the books in collected form, then worth picking up. It's very definitely, I mean, this is mostly stuff from the 90s and early 2000s, so it's, you know, the old Vertigo era, John Constantine, not this new version. So yeah, so I liked that because I haven't been a huge fan of most of the new versions, despite the fact that I bought this. Then I followed that up with some nonfiction. This is Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and Other Lessons from the Crematory, which is by the woman who has the YouTube channel Ask a Mortician. This is a memoir of primarily her first year in the funeral industry. When she was just out of university, she worked as a crematory operator at a mortuary in San Francisco. And so the first about 80% of the book is stories, primarily from cremations, but also stories of picking up bodies at hospitals, at private homes. There are some discussions with the embalmer at the mortuary. And as she worked there, she became more and more against the practice of embalming. And she founded the Order of the Good Death, which is a sort of natural funeral, I guess, sort of green funerals, but her argument for it is less about environmentalism as it is about the separation of people from death. As her attitude towards that style of funeral becomes more negative, she starts pushing more the idea of her good death idea. And I use air quotes not because I'm against that. I think if you are outside of North America, or you're within certain cultures in North America, that's not a new idea. One of the things she's very negative about is that some funeral directors will actually lie to people and tell them that it's illegal to keep a body at home, that you need to call the funeral home right away and have them clean it up, when in fact, in most jurisdictions, that's not illegal at all. And the family can certainly be washing the body and laying it out at home, and so on. Whether that seems strange to you is going to depend, as I said, on where you're from and your culture, because outside of North America, that is less common. And there are some countries where it's done. I know, like when my grandmother in Belgium died, she was laid out in my aunt's house where she died. That's what you do. My friends in Canada, it's almost been a sort of a religious thing. Like, most of the Christians I know have been embalmed. Most of the Muslims are washed by their families, and that's they both coexist, and people are aware of both. So I think she happened to be in an area where the whole embalming and everything being done by a funeral home was super common for the majority of the population. So I think that's why she had so much more frustration with it than I think some people would elsewhere. But I don't want to overstate that. That's definitely a theme, and in the final maybe 20% of the book, she quits that job and goes to mortuary school so that she'll have the certifications to start a natural funeral home. One of the themes in this was that she feels that people are uncomfortable with death because they're so hidden by it. And some of that is that the funeral homes take care of bodies so people don't see bodies. And even things like the existence of caskets as opposed to coffins, which are shaped like a rectangle as opposed to shaped like a person. Really interesting. A lot of the stories are really, there's one chapter devoted to infant cremations, which is just super depressing. So be aware of that going in. A lot of it is extremely sad. But again, interesting, because she was going from a position of the standard, you don't see death unless some relative dies, or she talks about having seen a random death as a child, but to living death and cremating all of these people every day. The writing style is very engaging. Most of it is conversational, but she has a lot of classical and historical and literary references sprinkled throughout, which is an interesting writing style. So yeah, definitely an engaging read, really interesting look into the funeral industry, so I really appreciated reading this. And then, finally, I read something that is completely different. Guardians of the Whills by Greg Rucka, which is a Star Wars tie-in. It is the backstory to Baze and Chirrut from Rogue One. It's their lives on Jedha helping orphans. And they have some nice fight scenes, so you can imagine Donnie Yen hitting people with a stick, which was my favorite part from the movie. I think Greg Rucka does a good job writing these franchise products. These are sort of written at a young adult / middle grade kind of level, which is the same style as this earlier series, which, again, Rucka wrote a few of those. There were also some other authors. What irritates me about that is that this is, a nice enough looking book on its own. It's a hardcover. It is not the same size as this earlier series, which you'd think. you're publishing this Star Wars tie-in, it's the same author, it's the same type of thing, you know, prequeling movie characters, why aren't they the same size? That irritated me. However, that aside, I did think this book was done in a really cute way. Each chapter opens with, like, Jedi or Force-related prayers, which is fitting since the characters are a monk and an ex-monk. It has, as all of these books do, a few illustrations. I think there are only 3. I was expecting more illustrations than it actually had. None of these franchise books are particularly great art, but this one is definitely done very well for what it is. Whether you would enjoy this is, do you want to know these characters' backstories? If you do, there you go, some backstory. You can watch them save orphans and bicker like an old married couple. Actually, as I say that, I realized if you were curious about their whole, like, life story and what it was like as the monks and all that, no, this is all set after the Imperials had destroyed the temple. So if you were looking for that backstory, that's not what this is. This is basically an adventure story set very close before the movie, not distant. Which, hey, who knows, maybe they'll do another book or comic about those characters. I don't know. You know how the Star Wars tie-ins are. They're endless. Anyway, that was the end of the month for me and the beginning of May, because this actually just came out yesterday. So how was your reading month? Any favorites? Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.